Thomas Park was watching the security feed at 6:19 a.m. when he called the police. A woman behind his Morrison Street bakery canvas bag, moving fast and quiet through the bread bins, the ones his night crew filled at closing, the ones that went to the dumpster at 7 when the morning batch came out. He gave the address, described what he saw. 4 minutes, the dispatcher said. He set the phone down and looked at the screen. The woman straightened up, turned slightly. The loading dock light caught her neck, something silver, on a chain, small. He stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. He picked up the phone. "I need to cancel that call," he said. "Sir, once a report is filed, please," he said. "Cancel it." He was already at the door. 4 minutes. Grace Park woke up at 5:40 a.m., not an alarm. Her body had learned the time the way it learned everything useful. Through repetition, through consequence, through the understanding that 5:40 was the difference between getting there before the night crew left and not getting there at all. She dressed in the dark. Jeans, thermal, the gray jacket that had a tear at the left pocket. She kept meaning to sew. She'd been meaning to sew it for 4 months. The needle and thread were on the kitchen counter. Every morning she walked past them on the way out. She checked on Daniel, 6 years old, sleeping on his stomach with one arm hanging off the bed, the way he'd slept since he was 2. She stood in the doorway long enough to see his back rise and fall. Then she went to the kitchen and picked up the canvas bag. The bag was the thing she'd thought about most before she started. Not the going. The going had been obvious once the math had run out of options. The bag. Because the bag meant she'd made a decision, and decisions meant she couldn't pretend she was just passing by. She'd made the decision anyway. 8 months ago, October. Daniel had started kindergarten in September, and the fees had come. Materials, activities, the school pictures she hadn't budgeted for because she hadn't known to budget for them. The math had always been tight. September made it something else. She'd walked past the bakery at 6 a.m. on a Thursday and seen the bins. Full. Clean. Bread that had been baked the day before and couldn't be sold as fresh and would be in a dumpster by 7. She'd stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Then she'd gone home and gotten a bag. She told herself it was temporary. She'd told herself that for 8 months. The rule was simple. She'd made it herself, first morning, and had not broken it once. Take only what she needed. Leave everything neat. Never take the last of anything. The last rule wasn't practical. It was something else, a line she'd drawn to stay on the right side of something she didn't have a clean word for. If she left some, it meant she wasn't desperate. It meant she was choosing. The distinction mattered in a way that was hard to explain, and that she hadn't tried to explain to anyone, because there was no one to explain it to. Daniel didn't know. That was the thing she carried that weighed more than the bag. He was 6. He was perceptive, in the way of children, who spent a lot of time with one parent and had learned to read that parent the way other kids read picture books. Carefully, looking for meaning underneath the surface. 3 weeks ago, he'd woken up early and found her gone and had asked, when she got back, where she went. She'd said, "Errands." He'd looked at the bag, at the bread inside. "Mom, are you taking bread because we don't have enough?" She'd said no. She'd said it the way she said everything she needed him to believe, directly, without hesitation, with the full weight of her face behind it. "We have enough," she said. "I just don't like to waste things." He'd nodded, accepted it, gone to get his cereal. She'd stood at the counter and looked at the bread in the bag and understood she had just lied to her son in the exact way she'd promised herself she never would. Not to protect herself, to protect him, which felt different and was also still a lie. She was working on telling him the truth. She hadn't gotten there yet. The necklace had been Daniel's idea. She'd bought a box at a garage sale on a Saturday afternoon, the two of them walking the neighborhood the way they walked it on weekends when the weather was okay and they needed somewhere to be that didn't cost anything. $1 a bag. A woman selling things from her driveway. The specific cheerful chaos of someone who had decided to simplify. The box had had earrings and a broken watch and some coins from countries she didn't recognize, and the necklace. Silver chain. Small pendant. A shape she hadn't recognized at first. Something between a leaf and a teardrop and something else. Daniel had picked it up. "Mom, it looks like bread." She'd looked at it. He was right. The pendant was shaped like a small loaf. Stylized, handmade, The kind of detail that meant someone had designed it specifically rather than pulled it from a catalog. It looks like something a good person would wear, Daniel said. He was 6. He said things like that without knowing what they cost. She'd bought the box for $2. She wore the necklace every day after that. Not because of what it was, because of what her son had said about it. Because on the mornings when she was walking to Morrison Street with the canvas bag and the gray jacket with the torn pocket and the weight of the lies she hadn't fixed yet, she wanted something around her neck that her son had called something a good person would wear. It helped. She didn't know why it helped exactly. It just did. Morrison Street at 6:20 a.m. was quiet in the way that streets were quiet when the night shift had ended and the day shift hadn't started and the city was in between versions of itself. She went around the back. The bread bins were where they always were. 3 of them, gray plastic, lined up against the wall under the loading dock light. She set the bag on the ground. She put on the gloves she kept in the pocket without the tear. She started with the top bin. She didn't hear the door open behind her. She didn't hear him come down the stairs. What she heard 30 seconds later was a man's voice saying her name. Not her name, just, "Hey." She turned around. Thomas Park had not slept well. Not because of the policy. He'd signed policies at midnight before. That was not unusual. That was Tuesday. What was unusual was that he'd woken up at 3 a.m. and lain in the dark and thought about his mother. Suyeon Park had opened the first Park & Sons on Southeast Hawthorne in 1989 with $800 in savings, a rented mixer, and a recipe book she'd carried from Seoul in her coat pocket because it was the one thing she would not put in a check bag. She'd made bread every morning at 4. Not because the business required it at 4, because she believed bread made before sunrise tasted different from bread made after. She'd never been able to explain this scientifically. She hadn't tried. She'd just said it, consistently for 12 years, and Thomas had grown up believing it without questioning it the way children believed things to question everything. Before they learned, he still believed it. He just hadn't made bread at 4 in the morning in 30 years. He ran 34 bakeries now. The bread got made by staff on rotating schedules optimized for output and labor cost. The recipe book was in a glass case in his office. Preserved, protected, never opened. He'd had it framed 3 years ago when the case cracked. His assistant had arranged it. He hadn't been in the room when it was done. His mother had 3 rules about bread. Make it right. Share it freely. Never throw it away. Bread thrown away, she used to say, is a sin against the hands that made it. He'd grown up with that. Had opened the first Park & Sons extension in 2003 with a zero-waste policy that donated every unsold loaf to the shelter on Burnside by 8 every morning. Then the company had gotten bigger. The logistics of donation got complicated. Liability, food safety compliance, the gap between when the bread was ready and when the shelters could receive it. His operations team had flagged it in 2011. His legal team had confirmed the liability exposure. His CFO had shown him the numbers. He'd changed the policy. Waste disposal was cleaner, cheaper, faster. He'd told himself it was temporary. He'd been telling himself that for 13 years. Last night at 11:47 p.m., he'd signed a new freshness standard across all 34 locations. Tighter pull times, bread off the shelf 2 hours earlier than the current standard. The quality control team had recommended it after customer feedback showed preference for peak fresh product. The operations team had flagged it in a footnote. Estimated increase in disposal volume, 28-32%. He'd read the footnote. He'd signed anyway. At 3 a.m., he'd thought about his mother. At 6:19 a.m., he'd been at his desk watching the security feed when the woman appeared at the bread bins. He'd called the police without thinking about it. Reflex. The same reflex that had changed the donation policy in 2011 and signed the freshness standard at 11:47 last night. The reflex of a man who had learned to manage risk so efficiently that he'd stopped asking what the risk actually was. He'd looked at the screen. He'd seen the necklace. He'd stopped thinking about risk entirely. The necklace was silver, small pendant. His mother had commissioned it in 1987 from a jeweler in Insadong, a tiny shop on a side street that his mother had described so many times he could picture it without having been there. She'd wanted something that represented what she did, what she was. The jeweler had made a small loaf of bread in silver, handmade, one of a kind. His mother had worn it every day from 1987 until she died in 2001. Thomas had been 34. He'd sat with her in the hospital and held her hand. And the necklace had been there, on her neck. The small silver loaf catching the fluorescent light. When he'd gone to collect her things the next day, the necklace wasn't there. He'd asked the nurses, asked the hospital, gone back twice. Filed a report with Lost, and found that had produced nothing. He'd spent a year looking. Then he'd stopped looking, because some things you had to stop looking for, or they became the only thing you did. He'd thought about it less as the years went on. Thought about it more on the days he thought about her. Today was one of those days. Had been since 3 a.m. When he'd woken up and lain in the dark and thought about a woman who had made bread before sunrise because she believed it tasted different and who had never thrown a single loaf away in 12 years of running a bakery on Southeast Hawthorne. He'd signed a policy last night that would throw away 30% more bread. He was running down the stairs of his flagship bakery at 6:21 a.m. with 4 minutes before the police arrived and his mother's necklace on the neck of a woman he'd never met. He didn't know what he was going to say. He just knew he had to get there first. He came around the corner of the building at 6:21 a.m. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the loading dock stairs, fast, not running exactly. The controlled urgency of someone moving as quickly as they could without falling. She pulled her hands out of the bin and turned around. A man, late 50s, dress shirt, no jacket, the look of someone who had left a warm room in a hurry and hadn't thought about the cold until he was already in it. He was breathing harder than the stairs justified. He stopped when he saw her. She waited. She'd been waiting for this moment for 8 months, not this specific moment. Not this man, this bakery, this morning. But the moment. The one where someone came around the corner and looked at her the way this man was looking at her, and the 8 months ended. She'd rehearsed what she would say. She didn't say it. Because he wasn't looking at her the way she'd expected. He was looking at her neck. "Your necklace," he said. Not, "What are you doing here?" Not, "I've called the police." Not any of the things she'd prepared for. Your necklace. She reached up, touched the pendant. The small silver loaf warm from her skin. "What about it?" she said. He opened his mouth. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something crossed his face. Not the phone itself, what the phone meant. He held up one finger, turned slightly away. "Yes," he said into the phone. "This is Thomas Park. I called about, yes, I need to cancel the report." A pause. "I understand. Please, it's my property. I'm here. There's no," another pause. Longer.
Thank you.
He hung up. Turned back to her. She looked at him at the phone in his hand. She was good at math. Had been doing it every morning for 8 months. How much bread, how much time, how much margin between what she needed and what she could justify taking. The math in front of her now was simpler and worse. He had called the police. He had just canceled it. The reason he'd canceled it was standing around her neck. "You called the police," she said. He didn't deny it. "Yes," he said. She looked at the bin, at the bag on the ground, at the bread she'd sorted, the good pile, the uncertain pile, the things she'd put back because the seal was broken, or the bag was damaged, or she couldn't be sure. She'd left more than she'd taken. She always left more than she'd taken. "I'll go," she said. She bent down for the bag. "Wait," he said. She stopped, didn't stand up fully, the bag handle in her hand. "Please," he said. She stood up. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had a lot to say and didn't know which part came first. She recognized the expression. She'd worn it herself the morning she'd told Daniel's kindergarten teacher that things were fine at home, and had stood in the hallway after, and understood she'd said the true version of a false thing. Things were fine. Fine wasn't enough. "The necklace," he said again. "Where did you get it?" She looked at him for a long moment. A man who owned the building she was standing behind, who had called the police and canceled it in the same 3 minutes, who was standing in a dress shirt in February without a jacket, because he'd left too fast to think about it, who was looking at a piece of silver around her neck like it was the only thing in the world. "Garage sale," she said. "Last spring. I paid $2 for a box." He was very still. "The box," he said. "Do you still have it?" "No," she said. "I kept the necklace. Threw the rest away." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone absorbing information that hurt and was also exactly what they'd expected. "It was my mother's," he said. She looked at the pendant, at the small silver loaf she'd worn every day for 7 months. Because her son had said it looked like something a good person would wear, she reached for the clasp. Don't, he said, quickly. Please don't take it off, she stopped. It's yours, she said. It was hers, he said. She's been gone 23 years. I don't know how it got from where she died to a garage sale box. He looked at the necklace. But it did, and it's here. And he stopped. She waited. He looked at the bins, at the bread she'd sorted. The good pile, the careful pile, the things she'd put back. He looked at her gloves, at the canvas bag, at the gray jacket with the tear at the left pocket. You do this every morning, he said, not a question. 8 months, she said. She wasn't going to lie about it. Not to the man who owned the building, not to anyone. She was tired of the shape lying made inside her chest. Alone, he said. Yes, before 6:30. Before the dumpster truck, she said. After that, it's gone. He looked at the bins again. At the bread that would be in a dumpster in 37 minutes. At the policy he'd signed at 11:47 last night. That would put 30% more of it there starting next week. He didn't say anything about the policy. She didn't know about the policy. That asymmetry sat between them in the February cold, and he felt it the way you felt something that was true and inconvenient and yours to carry. Because you were the one who'd created it. My mother had a rule, he said. She waited. Bread thrown away, he said, is a sin against the hands that made it. She looked at him. At the man who owned 34 bakeries and was standing behind one of them at 6:23 in the morning in a dress shirt in February telling her his dead mother's rule about bread. I believe that too, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not the crack of revelation or the performance of being moved, just a small, quiet shift. The kind that happened when someone said thing you'd stopped believing you'd hear from another person. I know, he said. That's why I came down. 2 minutes. He still had 2 minutes before the police arrived, canceled or not. Procedure meant a car might still come, might still pull up on Morrison Street and make this something it didn't need to be. Come inside, he said. She looked at the door. At the bakery that had been feeding her son for 8 months without knowing it. Why, she said. Because it's cold, he said. And because I have questions. And because, he stopped, looked at the necklace one more time, because my mother would have already had you inside with coffee 20 minutes ago. And I'm trying to catch up. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she picked up the bag. She followed him in. The bakery at 6:24 in the morning smelled like the thing Thomas had stopped noticing 20 years ago. Bread. Real bread. Not the idea of it, not the marketing version, the actual smell of flour and heat and something alive happening in an oven. It hit Grace when she walked through the door, and she stopped for half a second before she caught herself. Daniel would love this smell. She filed that away. Later. Thomas was already at the counter. A woman was there. 50s. Korean American. The particular stillness of someone who had seen unexpected things before and had learned to absorb them without performance. She looked at Grace, looked at Thomas, looked at the canvas bag, said nothing. Ji Young, Thomas said. Coffee. Please, Ji Young turned to the machine without a word. Thomas pulled out a stool at the counter and gestured at it. Grace sat. She put the canvas bag on the floor between her feet. She didn't let go of it. Ji Young set 2 cups on the counter. Black, both of them. She didn't ask. She turned back to her work. The morning prep. The kind of focused movement that made clear she was giving them privacy without leaving the room. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup. Hot. She hadn't realized how cold her hands were until they weren't. Thomas sat across from her. He looked at the necklace again, then looked away, like he was trying to be polite about it. How long have you been coming here? He said. 8 months, she said. October. Every morning? Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, she said. Those are the heaviest disposal days. Higher volume from the weekend baking on Saturday. Higher weekday baking residual on Tuesday. He looked at her. You mapped our disposal pattern, he said. I needed to know when to come, she said. Not defensively, just accurately. He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. Ji Young, he said. Ji Young turned. Did you know? He said. A pause. Yes, Ji Young said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. How long? He said. Since November, Ji Young said. The second week she came. She turned back to the counter. I was here early. I saw her. I watched for a few mornings before I said anything. You said something to her? Thomas said. I left the bins unlocked, Ji Young said. They lock automatically at 6. I changed the timer. The room was quiet. Grace looked at Ji Young's back. At the woman who had changed a timer without being asked and had never mentioned it and had been letting Grace in. Not literally, but the next closest thing for 7 months. She hadn't known. She'd thought she was slipping through a gap in the system. She just hadn't known. The gap had been deliberately made wider by a woman with a key. You didn't tell me, Thomas said. No, Ji Young said. Why not? Ji Young turned around. She looked at Thomas the way someone looked at a person they'd worked with for 20 years and were deciding in real time how honest to be, she decided. Because I knew what you'd do, she said. You'd have called legal. Legal would have flagged liability. Liability would have meant locking the bins tighter and adding a camera angle and writing a policy. She paused. And the bread would still have gone in the dumpster. Thomas said nothing. Grace looked at the counter, at the small, handmade silver loaf around her neck. At the bread, Ji Young was arranging for the morning display. Fresh batch, just out. The kind that would be there when the first customers arrived at 7. Beautiful. Exactly right. The kind that made the previous day's bread impossible to sell. How much goes out each night? Grace said. Both of them looked at her. Here, she said, this location. How much bread goes in the bins each night? Thomas glanced at Ji Young. 70 to 90 pounds, Ji Young said. Depending on the day, Grace did the math. She was fast at it. 8 months of morning math had made her fast. 34 locations, she said. If they're averaging similar volume, they're not all the same size, Thomas said. If the average is 60 pounds, she said, that's 2,000 pounds a night. Across the chain, he looked at her. That's not counting the new standard, he said quietly. She looked at him. What new standard? She said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant something existed that he hadn't said yet and was deciding whether to say it. Last night, he said, I signed a new freshness policy. Tighter pull times. Bread comes off the shelf 2 hours earlier. He looked at his coffee. Operations team estimated it would increase disposal volume by 30%. Grace looked at him, at the man who had run down the stairs at 6:21 in the morning because of his mother's necklace and who had signed a policy at 11:47 the night before that would put 30% more of his mother's bread in a dumpster. She didn't say that. She didn't have to. He knew. She could see that he knew. 60 pounds average, she said. 30% more. That's another 600 pounds a night across the chain. He nodded. On top of the 2,000, she said. Yes, he said. Ji Young had stopped moving at the counter. Not dramatically. She just wasn't moving anymore. The three of them sat in the warm bakery that smelled like bread that was being made right, and thought about bread that wasn't being used right, and nobody said anything for a moment because the math was doing the talking. Grace picked up her coffee. Drank. It was good coffee. Better than she made at home, which she made weak to stretch the grounds. Your mother's rule, she said. Thomas looked at her. Bread thrown away is a sin against the hands that made it, she said. You told me that outside. Yes, he said. Do your staff know that rule? She said. He thought about it. No, he said. Did you tell them when you changed the donation policy in? She stopped. She didn't know when he'd changed it. She was extrapolating from the bins, from 8 months of seeing what went in them, and understanding that someone had decided at some point that dumpsters were easier than shelters. 2011, he said. She nodded. No, he said. I didn't tell them the rule. I told them the liability exposure and the logistics gap and the CFO's numbers, and they made a decision based on what you told them, she said. Yes, he said. And last night, she said, the 30%. What did you tell them when you signed it? He looked at her. I told them the customer feedback data and the quality metrics and the projected revenue impact, he said. And they gave you a footnote about disposal volume, she said. Yes, he said. And you signed it anyway, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at her coffee, at the canvas bag between her feet, at the bread she'd sorted outside. The good pile, the careful pile, the things she'd put back. My son is 6, she said. His name is Daniel. Last week he told me bread is just flour and love. She looked up. He said that because I told him your bread. I didn't say it was yours. I said the bread we had. I told him someone made it with their hands early in the morning, before the sun came up. She paused. I didn't want him to think it came from a bin. I wanted him to think it came from someone who cared about making it. Thomas was very still. He was right, Grace said. Wasn't he? Someone did make it that way. Yes, Thomas said. She did. He wasn't talking about his staff. Grace knew he wasn't talking about his staff. The necklace was warm against her collarbone. Mr. Park, she said. Thomas, he said. Thomas, she said, what happened to the donation program? The original one, he told her. Liability. Logistics. The gap between when the bread was ready and when the shelters could receive it. The operations team, the legal team, the CFO, the numbers. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The gap, she said, between when the bread is ready and when the shelters can receive it. What is it? 2 hours, he said, roughly. The shelters open at 8. The bread is ready to pull at 6. 2 hours, she said. Yes. So the bread sits, she said, for 2 hours. And then it goes in a bin. Yes, he said. She looked at the canvas bag. I'm here at 6, she said. He looked at her. I know 14 families, she said, in this neighborhood. Women I know from Daniel's school, from the laundromat, from the shelter I stayed in 3 years ago. She paused. If someone had bread at 6, I could have it to 14 families by 7:30. Before the shelters even opened, she wasn't proposing anything. She was just doing the math out loud. Thomas looked at her, at the canvas bag, at the necklace, at the woman who had been solving his company's waste problem with a canvas bag and a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday schedule for 8 months, and who had just described, in 4 sentences, the solution to the logistics gap that had caused him to abandon his mother's rule in 2011. Ji Young had turned around. She was listening. The bakery was warm, not just heated, warm the way places were warm when they had been producing heat from within for a long time. Ovens running since 4 in the morning. Bread coming out in batches. The walls absorbing it over years until the warmth was in the building itself, not just the air. Grace wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt it move up her arms. Ji Young had gone back to work, not conspicuously. She'd simply returned to what she'd been doing. The morning prep that ran on its own schedule, regardless of what conversations happened around it. But she was close enough, present enough. Thomas was looking at the canvas bag on the floor. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, he said. Yes, Grace said, for 8 months. He looked at the bins through the back window. Still out there, full. 40 minutes until the dumpster truck. You never took more than you needed, he said. She looked at him. How do you know that? She said. Ji Young, he said. She looked at Ji Young's back. Ji Young didn't turn around. She watched, Grace said. The first few mornings, Thomas said, before she changed the timer. Grace held that for a moment. 7 months of thinking she was invisible. 7 months of thinking she was slipping through a gap. The gap had been held open by a woman who had watched her sort through bread the way you watched someone to understand who they were before you decided what to do about them. Ji Young had watched. Ji Young had changed the timer. Ji Young had never said a word. Thank you, Grace said. Ji Young turned around just enough. Don't thank me, she said. Just don't be late. She turned back. Grace almost smiled. Thomas looked at his coffee. My mother had a second rule, he said. Beyond the one I told you. Grace waited. She said you could tell everything about a person by how they treated food, he said. Not what they ate. How they handled it. Whether they were careful with it. He looked at the canvas bag. Whether they understood that someone's hands had made it. Grace looked at the bag. At the bread inside. Daniel said something to me last week, she said. Thomas looked at her. He's 6, she said. He asks questions the way 6-year-olds ask questions. Not because he wants the adult answer, because he wants to know what he actually thinks. She paused. He was eating bread at the kitchen table. Just bread, nothing on it. And he stopped and looked at it and said, Mom, is bread just flour and love? The bakery was quiet. Ji Young had stopped moving again. I said yes, Grace said. I said that's exactly what it is. Thomas looked at her. He said, then whoever made this must have loved a lot of people. Thomas looked at the table, at the coffee cup, at his hands, the hands that had not made bread in 30 years, that signed policies and reviewed quarterlies and managed 34 locations from a desk on the second floor of a building where other people's hands made the bread at 4 in the morning. His mother's hands had been rough, He remembered them specifically, the way she'd looked at her own hands sometimes after a long morning, not with complaint, with a kind of private acknowledgement. These hands made this. This mattered. His hands were smooth. He hadn't thought about that in years. She didn't know, Grace said, that it came from a bin. No, Thomas said. I told him someone made it early in the morning, she said, before the sun came up, because I wanted him to know the truth of it, even if I couldn't tell him the whole truth. She looked at her coffee. Someone did make it that way. Your staff did. At 4 in the morning, with the right flour and the right heat, and however many years of knowing how. She paused. That part was true. Yes. The bin wasn't their fault, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. He stood up. He went to the window. The bins, 3 of them, gray plastic, full. He thought about 2011, the liability exposure, the logistics gap, the CFO's numbers, the operations team's recommendation. The way the decision had felt, at the time, like the responsible thing, the adult version of running a company rather than a small bakery on Southeast Hawthorne where a woman made bread before sunrise because she believed it tasted different. He'd made a lot of responsible decisions since then. He'd signed a policy last night. He turned around. The logistics gap, he said, 2 hours. Bread ready at 6, shelters open at 8. Yes, Grace said. You said you know 14 families. In this neighborhood, she said. From Daniel's school, from the laundromat, from the shelter. She paused. I know more than that across the city. Women I've met over 3 years. They're not hard to find if you're looking. How long would it take, he said, to move bread from here to 14 families? She didn't hesitate. Hour and a half, she said, if I had a car, 2 hours on foot and bus. She looked at him. I don't have a car. He nodded. What if you did? He said. She looked at him. Not with hope, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that questions like that came in 2 versions. The version that was building towards something real, and the version that was building toward a feeling of having helped without changing anything. She was trying to read which one this was. Then an hour, she said. Maybe less. Across how many locations could you scale that, he said. If you had the infrastructure. She looked at him. You're not asking about 14 families, she said. No, he said. She looked at Ji Young. Ji Young was listening, still not turning around. But listening. Portland Metro, Grace said slowly. If you're talking about Portland Metro, and you're talking about a real distribution network, not one person with a canvas bag, an actual network with drivers and routes and coordination. She stopped, did the math, the way she always did math. Fast, from the ground up, not from the top down. You have 11 locations in Portland Metro. 12, Thomas said. We're opening Beaverton in April. 12 locations, she said. 70 to 90 pounds per night average. Call it 80. That's 960 pounds a night. More with the new standard, Thomas said. More with the new standard, she said. She looked at him. You're not implementing the new standard. It wasn't a question. Thomas looked at her. No, he said. She nodded. 960 pounds. She looked at the canvas bag on the floor. At the bread inside, 23 pounds, she'd weighed it on the kitchen scale. Before she left this morning, as she always did, because knowing exactly what she had was the only way to know what she could do with it. 23 pounds. 960. You'd need drivers, she said. People who know the neighborhoods. Who know which families, which shelters, which community fridges, which churches have food programs on weekday mornings. She paused. You can't outsource that knowledge. You have to find people who already have it. I know, he said. That's not a logistics problem, she said. That's a community problem. You solve it with community, not with a contract. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. How long have you known that? She said. He looked at the bins. Since 2011, he said. I just stopped acting like I knew it. The bakery was quiet. The ovens ran. The smell of bread, real bread, made before sunrise, by hands that understood what they were doing, moved through the room the way it had moved through a small shop on Southeast Hawthorne for 12 years before everything got bigger. Thomas, Ji Young said. Both of them looked at her. She was holding a loaf, fresh, just out. The kind that would be in the display case in 20 minutes when the doors opened. She set it on the counter in front of Grace. For Daniel, she said. Grace looked at the loaf, at the perfectly scored top, the color, the weight of it. She looked at Ji Young. Bread is just flour and love, Ji Young said. Your son is right. Grace picked up the loaf. It was still warm. Thomas went back to his office at 7:15. Not because the conversation was over, because Ji Young had looked at the clock and said the morning crew was coming in, and Grace needed to get to work. And some things were better continued. After everyone had had time to think, Grace had left with the loaf under her arm and the canvas bag over her shoulder. Thomas had watched her go from the window. Then he'd gone upstairs. His office was on the second floor, a room he'd chosen specifically because it overlooked the production floor, because he'd wanted to stay connected to where the bread was made. He'd made that choice in 2009 when they opened the Morrison Street flagship. He sat at his desk every morning and looked down at his staff working the ovens. He'd stopped seeing it a long time ago. The way you stopped seeing anything you looked at every day without looking at. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the policy he'd signed at 11:47 last night. Read it again, not the summary, the full document. Every line, page 1. Quality standards rationale. Customer feedback data showing preference for peak fresh product. Blind taste tests across 3 locations. Statistical significance confirmed. Page 2. Implementation timeline. Rolling out across all 34 locations over 6 weeks. Staff training materials attached. Page 3. Projected revenue impact. 3. 2% improvement in customer satisfaction scores. Projected 1. 8% revenue increase across the chain based on comparable implementations at other regional bakery chains. Page 4. Operational impact. He read page 4 slowly. Estimated increase in disposal volume. 28-32% across all locations. Disposal costs will increase accordingly. Current disposal contract pricing locked through end of fiscal year. He looked at the number, 28-32%. He'd read it last night. He'd read it and thought, disposal costs are manageable. The revenue upside outweighs it. This is the right call for the brand. He hadn't thought about what 28 to 32% meant in pounds. He did the math now, 34 locations. Average 80 pounds per night per location. Current disposal. 720 pounds nightly across the chain, 28-32% increase. Low end, 762 additional pounds per night. High end, 870 additional pounds per night. Call it 800. 800 additional pounds of bread in dumpsters every night starting in 6 weeks. He wrote it on a notepad, not on the laptop, on paper. Because numbers on paper were harder to close. 800 pounds night additional, times 365 nights, 292,000 pounds. He looked at that number. 292,000 pounds of bread per year. On top of the 992,800 pounds they were already disposing of annually. He hadn't known that second number until this morning. He'd known the disposal cost. He hadn't known the weight. There was a difference between knowing something costs money and knowing what the thing is. He opened a new tab. Searched average weight of bread loaf, 24 ounces, 1.5 pounds. He divided 292,000 pounds divided by 1. 594,666 loaves per year additional. From the policy he'd signed last night. He wrote that number down too, 194,666 loaves. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Grace, 23 pounds in a canvas bag, 14 families. An hour and a half on foot and bus. He thought about Daniel. Whoever made this must have loved a lot of people. He thought about his mother. Suyeon Park had never disposed of a loaf in 12 years. Not one. He had records. Not from her time. She hadn't kept records the way he kept records. She'd kept everything in her head and in the recipe book and in the relationships she'd built with the shelter on Burnside and the church on Division and the 3 families on their block who she'd sent bread to every Friday without being asked and without making a thing of it. He had her recipe book in a glass case 12 feet from where he was sitting. He hadn't opened it since he'd had it framed. He stood up. He walked to the case. The book was small. Soft cover, spiral bound, the kind sold at drugstores. His mother had filled it over 20 years. Recipes in Korean on the left pages. Notes in English on the right, not translations. Separate thoughts. The Korean pages were the how. The English pages were the why. He'd known this. He'd never read the English pages. He unlatched the case, picked up the book, opened it to the first English page. His mother's handwriting. Careful, slightly formal, the English of someone who had learned it as an adult and treated it with respect. Bread is not a product. Bread is a decision. Every morning you decide, who am I making this for? If the answer is only the people who can pay for it, you are making a smaller thing than bread. He stood at the case and read it twice. Then he turned pages. Not looking for anything, just reading. The woman at the shelter on Burnside told me she can always tell which bread comes from us. I asked her how. She said ours tastes like it was made by someone who wanted to make it. I did not know how to explain that this is the only way I know how to make anything. He turned another page. Thomas asked me today why I get up at 4. I told him the bread tastes different before sunrise. He accepted this. Children accept things that are true, even when the explanation is incomplete. I should tell him the real reason sometime. I get up at 4 because the hours before the world is watching are the hours when you can make something pure. No one is grading it yet. It is just you and the flour and whatever you are trying to give. He closed the book. He stood at the case for a moment. Then he went back to his desk. He picked up the phone and called his operations director, Kevin Park. No relation. Just a man who had worked for Thomas for 11 years and who answered his phone at 7:30 in the morning with the alertness of someone who had learned that early calls from Thomas meant something had changed. The freshness policy, Thomas said. The one I signed last night. Yes, Kevin said. We were going to start the rollout brief this week. Hold it, Thomas said. Silence. For how long? Kevin said. Until I tell you otherwise, Thomas said. I need to look at something first. The board reviewed the quality data, Kevin said carefully. The revenue projections? I know what the board reviewed, Thomas said. I was there. He paused. I need to look at something the board didn't review. What's that? Kevin said. Thomas looked at the notepad. 800 pounds night additional. 292,000 pounds. 194,666 loaves. What it costs to throw something away, he said. Not in dollars. In what it actually is. Kevin was quiet. Hold the rollout, Thomas said. I'll call you this afternoon. He hung up. He looked at the glass case. The recipe book back inside it now. The English pages he'd never read. The why behind the how that he'd put in a frame and looked at every day for 3 years without opening. He thought about Grace's 3 rules. She hadn't told him her rules. He'd inferred them from Ji Young's description of what she'd watched. Take only what you need. Leave everything neat. Never take the last of anything. He thought about his mother's 3 rules. Make it right. Share it freely. Never throw it away. He thought about how those 2 sets of rules were the same rule, said by 2 different women, in 2 different situations, at 2 different ends of the same problem. He picked up the notepad. He started writing. Not a policy, not a memo. A list, the kind you made when you were starting from the real question rather than the comfortable one. What does this company make? He wrote, bread. Who is it for? He stopped, looked at the question, thought about the English pages. If the answer is only the people who can pay for it, you are making a smaller thing than bread. He wrote, everyone that act like it. He put the pen down. He picked up the phone again. This time he called Ji Young. She answered on the second ring. The woman this morning, he said. Grace. Yes, Ji Young said. Do you have her number? A pause. No, Ji Young said, but I know where she'll be Thursday morning. Thomas looked at the window, at Morrison Street below. At the spot where the bins were, empty now, the dumpster truck had come at 7, everything gone. Tomorrow they'd fill up again. Thursday they'd fill up again. Every night until he did something about it. Thursday, he said, I'll be here. I know, Ji Young said. She said it the way she said everything, simply, without performance, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like she'd been waiting for him to say it for a long time. He was there at 6:05, not waiting inside. Outside, at the back of the building, standing next to the bins, the way you stood next to something you'd been thinking about for 2 days and needed to see again in person. February in Portland. Cold, damp, the kind of morning that didn't announce itself dramatically. Just arrived gray and settled in. He'd brought coffee. 2 cups from the machine upstairs. Not the good machine, the staff machine. He hadn't thought about that until he was already outside. Then he'd thought, good. The staff machine was the one his mother would have used. Grace came around the corner at 6:18, canvas bag, gray jacket. Moving with the particular efficiency of someone whose mornings ran on tight margins. She saw him, stopped, looked at the 2 cups in his hands. I'm not here to watch, he said. I'm here because I read my mother's recipe book Tuesday morning, and I have questions I should have asked a long time ago. She walked the rest of the way to the bins, set the bag down, took the coffee. What kind of questions? She said. The kind that start with, "What would you do if this worked?" He said. She looked at him over the cup. If what worked? She said. The distribution network, he said. 12 Portland metro locations. 960 pounds a night. Drivers who know the neighborhoods. Families who know the drivers. He paused. If you built that, what does it look like in a year? She put the coffee down on the edge of a bin. She opened the bag. She started working, gloves on, into the first bin, sorting with the same automatic precision he'd watched through the security feed 2 mornings ago. She didn't stop to answer. She sorted and talked the way people talked when they'd thought about something enough that they didn't need to stop doing other things to access it. 12 locations, she said. 3 drivers minimum. People who already know this city, not hired from outside. People already embedded in the communities you're trying to reach. She set aside a row of sourdough. Routes built around the families, not around the bakeries. You work backward from where the need is, not forward from where the bread is. That's a different logistics model, he said. Yes, she said. Most distribution models move product from a central point outward. This one moves from multiple points to multiple points. Harder to manage, more efficient at the destination. She moved to the second bin. You'd need a coordinator, someone who knows all 12 locations, all the families, all the drivers. Who can respond when something changes? A shelter closes, a family moves, a driver calls out. A hub, he said. A person, she said, not a hub. Hubs don't know that Marcus's foster placement changed or that Destiny's mom lost her job. She looked at him. You need someone who thinks like a neighbor, not like a logistics manager. He thought about that. The shelf life question, he said. The bread from Tuesday night, by Thursday morning, is fine, she said, for most of what I take. Sourdough, whole grain, dense loaves, 4 days easy if it's stored right. She paused. The pastries are a different story. Those need same-day distribution, which means you'd need someone at the location before 6 on days with high pastry disposal. You know our disposal patterns by product type, he said. 8 months, she said. He watched her sort. The good pile growing. She moved through the bins with zero wasted motion. Pick up, assess, sort, move on. No hesitation, no second guessing. The confidence of someone who had developed a skill through repetition and hadn't named it a skill because naming it would have required acknowledging what it was for. What else? He said. She paused, looked at him. You're actually asking, she said. Yes, he said. She set down a loaf. The families, she said. You can't treat this like a distribution program where product goes to recipients. That model creates dependency. People waiting for the truck. She shook her head. You have to build it so the families are part of it. Knowing the schedule, knowing the quantities. Planning around it like a resource they manage, rather than something that arrives at them. She picked the loaf back up. The difference between someone handing you a bag of bread and someone saying, Tuesday and Thursday, there's bread at the corner of 28th and Division. Here's the schedule. Here's the contact if something changes. One of those makes you a recipient. The other makes you someone who knows how to get what they need. Thomas was quiet. You've been thinking about this, he said. Since month 2, she said. When I understood the scale of what was going in these bins and understood that I was solving maybe 2% of it, she finished the third bin, stood up, looked at what she'd sorted. 31 pounds this morning. She'd counted in her head as she went. The drivers, the coordinator, the routes. Do you know people? She looked at him. I know 14 families, she said. They know other people. The women I know from the shelter, they know who needs what and when and how to get it there, because that's been their whole life. Knowing how to move resources through networks that don't show up on any map. She paused. You don't need to hire from outside. You need to pay the people already doing this work for free. Thomas looked at the bins. At 31 pounds sorted on the ground in front of them. At 960 pounds, they could move each night if the network existed. He thought about 2011, the operations team, the legal team, the CFO, the liability exposure, the logistics gap. He'd solved for liability. He hadn't solved for the gap. The gap had been solved by a woman with a canvas bag who showed up 3 mornings a week and sorted bread in the dark. The coordinator role, he said. The person who knows all 12 locations, all the families, all the drivers, who thinks like a neighbor and not like a logistics manager. Grace was putting the sorted bread into the canvas bag. What about it? She said. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to run a charity program, he said. I'm asking you to help me build something that should have existed since 2011. Something my mother would have built herself if the company had gotten this big while she was still here. He paused. That's a real job. With a real salary. And I'm asking because you've already been doing half of it for 8 months without being paid. Grace stopped packing the bag. She stood up straight. She looked at him, the way she'd looked at him Tuesday morning when he'd canceled the police call, with the careful, assessing attention of someone reading the space between what a person said and what they meant. She read it for a long time. He let her. I have a job, she said. I know, he said. Part-time, she said. $12 an hour. 3 days a week. I know, he said. Not because he'd looked her up, because Ji Young had told him Wednesday morning when he'd called to ask. He hadn't been comfortable asking Grace directly. He'd been comfortable with Ji Young telling him because Ji Young would only tell him what Grace would want him to know. What would this pay? She said. He told her. She looked at the canvas bag. At the loaf Ji Young had given her Tuesday morning. The one that was on her kitchen counter at home because she hadn't been able to bring herself to slice it yet, had just left it there, whole. The way you left things that meant something. Daniel doesn't know I come here, she said. I know, he said. I told him I don't like to waste things, she said. That's not a lie. No, he said. It's not. But it's not the whole truth either, she said. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. If I take this, she said. If I build this, it has to be built right. Not a program that runs for a year and gets cut when the next freshness policy comes through. Not something that depends on whoever is sitting in your office deciding it still matters. She looked at him steadily. It has to be built into the company, into how you operate. The same way the disposal contract is built in, the same way the freshness standards are built in. Yes, he said. Written down, she said. Not in a press release, in the operating agreement. Yes, he said. And the policy you signed Tuesday night, she said. He looked at her. Gone, he said. I called Kevin Wednesday morning. She nodded. She looked at the sorted bread on the ground. 31 pounds. Enough for 2 days for 3 families. She thought about 960. She thought about Daniel at the kitchen table. Whoever made this must have loved a lot of people. She thought about what it would mean to tell him the truth, not the whole truth at once. He was 6. The whole truth came in pieces, at the right times, when the pieces were things he could hold without them being too heavy. But the first piece, the real piece. I went to get bread for us because we needed it, and I found a way to get it, and there's nothing wrong with finding a way. She could tell him that now. If this was real, she could tell him that. She looked at Thomas. Thursday and Tuesday, she said. I still come Thursday and Tuesday. Yes, he said. Until the network is built, she said. And after that too, if I want to. Because this corner is where it started, and I'm not handing it to a driver until I know the driver knows what I know about who comes here and when and what they need. Yes, he said. And Ji Young, she said. She runs this location. Whatever we build, she's part of building it. She's been doing the real work here longer than either of us. Thomas looked at the back door. Ji Young was inside, had been since 5. Would be until close. 20 years of running the Morrison Street location with the quiet competence of someone who had learned that the most important work was usually the work no one was watching. Yes, he said. She's part of it. Grace picked up the canvas bag. 31 pounds. She looked at the bins, still some left. She'd taken what she needed, left the rest, same as always. I have to get to work, she said. I know, he said. She started walking. She turned around. Thomas, she said. He looked at her. Your mother's recipe book, she said. The English pages. He was quiet. Did you read them all? She said. Not yet, he said. She nodded. Read them, she said. She turned and walked. He stood at the bins in the February cold and watched her go. Canvas bag, gray jacket, 31 pounds of bread that was going to 14 families by 8 o'clock, and thought about a recipe book in a glass case and the English pages he'd been looking at for 3 years without reading. He went inside. He went upstairs. He unlatched the case. He sat down at his desk with his mother's book, opened to the first English page, and read every word she'd written. It took 40 minutes. He was late to his 9 o'clock. He didn't care. The first meeting was on a Monday, not in Thomas's office. In the break room at the Morrison Street location, the same room where Ji Young made coffee at 5 in the morning, and where the night crew ate before their shift, and where, 3 months ago, Grace Park had never been inside. Thomas had suggested his conference room. Ji Young had said no. She'd said it the way she said most things, briefly, without explanation, with the quiet authority of someone who had been right often enough that people had learned to ask why later rather than argue now. Later, Thomas had asked why. Because the people you're asking to build this have never been in your conference room, she said, and they're not going to say what they actually think in a room they've never been in before. He'd moved the meeting to the break room. There were 7 people. Grace, Ji Young. 3 women Grace had called, Maya, who ran an informal food network out of her apartment in Woodlawn and had been doing it for 6 years without any institutional support. Renata, who had driven a school bus for 11 years and knew every neighborhood in Portland Metro the way Thomas knew his balance sheet. And Claudia, who had spent 8 months at the Burnside shelter 2 years ago and now volunteered there 3 mornings a week and knew the intake coordinator by first name. And 2 people Thomas had brought. Kevin, his operations director, who had driven to the meeting without fully understanding why he was there, and who had understood by the end of the first 20 minutes. And a woman named Patricia Osei, no relation to anyone, who ran the legal and compliance side of Park & Sons, and who Thomas had asked specifically because every time they'd tried to do something like this before, legal had been the place it had stopped. He'd told Patricia, "You're here to find ways to say yes, not reasons to say no." She'd looked at him. "That's not usually how you use me," she said. "I know," he said. "Try it." The meeting ran 3 hours. Grace opened it. Not with a presentation, with the canvas bag. She put it on the table and opened it and laid out what was inside. The bread from that morning, sorted by type, by age, by destination. She talked through it the way she talked through everything. From the ground up, starting with what she actually did rather than what she thought it should look like at scale. Maya listened with the focused attention of someone hearing their own work, described in a language they hadn't had before. Renata pulled out a notebook and started drawing routes. Claudia said, "The shelter can receive at 6. They told us 8 because that's when the doors open. The kitchen is running at 6. Kevin looked up from his notepad. "The logistics gap is 2 hours, he said. "You're saying the gap isn't real." "The gap is between when you assumed they could receive and when they actually can," Claudia said. Nobody asked. Kevin wrote something down. Patricia was quiet through most of the first hour. Then she said, "The liability question. The reason we moved to disposal in 2011. Everyone looked at her. "The Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act," she said. "Federal law. Protects food donors from liability when donating in good faith to nonprofit organizations. We've been operating as if this protection didn't exist." Thomas looked at her. "We flagged liability in 2011, she said. "The legal team flagged it. I was not on that team. I looked it up this morning." She paused. "The Emerson Act has been federal law since 1996. The liability exposure we were worried about was largely protected. We stopped donating based on a risk that the law had already addressed." The room was quiet. Kevin looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the table. "Nobody checked," he said. "Nobody checked," Patricia confirmed. Not accusatorially, as a fact. The kind of fact that required acknowledgement before you could move past it. Grace was looking at the canvas bag. At 13 years of bread that had gone into dumpsters, because nobody had checked a federal law, she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The room said it for her. Renata had filled 2 pages with routes by the time they got to the operational model. 12 locations. 3 primary drivers. Renata knew 2 people who had retired from delivery work and wanted part-time routes. People who knew the city and didn't need training in geography, only in the specific requirements of the program. Morning pickups at 6. Routes built backward from the families and shelters, and community fridges, and church programs that Grace and Maya and Claudia had between them been supplying informally for years. Not a new network. An existing network with infrastructure finally attached to it. How long has this network existed? Kevin said. He was looking at the routes Renata had drawn, at the connections between them, at the density of it, the coverage across Portland Metro that the three women had built over years without anyone asking them to. 6 years for mine, Maya said. 4 for mine, Grace said. I inherited part of mine from a woman who did it for 8 years before me, Claudia said. She moved to Tacoma. She connected me before she left. Kevin looked at Thomas. We've been throwing away bread for 13 years, Kevin said, and there's been a distribution network operating in this city for at least 12 of those years. Yes, Thomas said, and nobody connected them. Nobody connected them, Thomas said. Kevin looked at the routes. Then he picked up his pen and started adding Park and Son's locations to Renata's map. The fit was almost exact. Not perfect. Nothing was perfect. But close enough that Grace, watching Kevin add the 12th location marker, felt something shift in her chest that she didn't try to name because naming it would have required stopping and she didn't want to stop. The numbers came next. 3 drivers. Part-time, morning routes 4 days a week. Coordinator role, Grace, pending her agreement to reduce her restaurant hours and transition over 6 weeks. Ji Young as the Morrison Street liaison, with a formal addition to her job description that named what she'd been doing informally for 7 months. Patricia had the employment documents drafted before the meeting ended. Not finalized. Drafted. Ready for review. She'd brought them because Thomas had told her to come ready to say yes. She'd taken him at his word. The coordinator's salary Thomas had offered Grace covered her restaurant hours with enough above to matter. Not life-changing in the way that got announced. Life-changing in the way that the math produced a different answer every month. The dentist appointment kept, the new jacket bought, the thing at the bottom of the list that finally made it off. Grace read the document. She read it the way she read everything important. Slowly, completely, not looking for the good parts but for the gaps, for the places where what it said and what it meant might diverge. There were no gaps. Patricia had written it without gaps. Thomas had told her to. Grace signed it. Not immediately. She took it home and read it again that night at the kitchen table after Daniel was asleep. She read it twice. Then she called her mother and Eugene and read the relevant sections out loud. And her mother asked 3 questions and Grace answered them. And her mother said, "Sign it." She signed it the next morning. She brought the signed copy to Ji Young. Not to Thomas, to Ji Young. Because Ji Young had been the first person to see her. Before Thomas, before the meeting, before any of it, Ji Young had watched 3 mornings, understood what she was watching, and changed a timer. That came first. Ji Young took the document, looked at it, put it on the counter. "Thursday," she said. "You're still here Thursday." "I'm still here Thursday," Grace said. Ji Young turned back to the ovens. The Morrison Street Bread Recovery Program launched 6 weeks later, not with a press release. Thomas had wanted one. Grace had said no. "A press release is for people who want credit," she said. "This is for the bread." Thomas had looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Tell me when the bread gets there," she said. That's the announcement. The first morning, 847 pounds across 11 locations. Renata's 2 drivers and Grace in the CRV, she'd borrowed from Maya because the coordinator budget included a vehicle allowance starting month 2, and she didn't have one yet. 3 hours, 21 stops. Ed Grace texted Thomas. It got there. He read it at his desk. He looked at the recipe book in the case. He'd unlatched it Tuesday. He'd read it Thursday. He hadn't closed the case since. He typed back. How much, she typed? 847 pounds. First night. He looked at the notepad on his desk, the one he'd written on Tuesday morning. 800 pounds night additional. That was what the new policy would have added to the dumpsters. 847 was what they'd moved instead. He looked at those 2 numbers for a long time. Then he opened a new document. Policy revision. Park and Son's Bread Recovery Program. Effective immediately. All 34 locations. Implementation timeline 90 days. He started writing. 6 months later, Grace came to Morrison Street on a Tuesday, not with the canvas bag. She stood at the empty bins for a moment. Not long, just long enough to remember what they'd looked like full, and what full had cost, and what empty now meant. Then she went inside. Ji Young had coffee ready. Didn't ask. Never asked. Grace sat at the counter and wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the warmth move up her arms, the same way it had the first Tuesday, when Thomas had come downstairs with 4 minutes to spare and a phone call he needed to cancel. The necklace was still there. She touched it. She'd told Daniel the truth in November. Not all of it. 6-year-olds received truth in pieces they could hold, but the first piece. I went to get bread because we needed it. I found a way. There's nothing wrong with finding a way. He'd looked at her. From the bakery? He said. The one that makes it before sunrise? Yes, she said. He'd thought about it. Good, he said, and went back to his drawing. She finished her coffee. Put the cup down. Ji Young, she said. Ji Young looked up. Thank you. For the timer. Ji Young held her gaze for a moment. Don't be late, she said. Turned back to the ovens. Upstairs, Thomas had his mother's recipe book open on his desk. Not in the case. On the desk. The way books were meant to be. This morning's page ended with one line his mother had written in 1994, and that he was reading for the first time 30 years later. You can only learn why the bread matters by feeding someone who needs it and watching what happens to both of you. He looked at the window, at the empty bins below, at the city waking up around them, ordinary, continuous, moving through its morning without knowing that 847 pounds of bread had left this block at 6 and would reach 21 stops before 8. He closed the book. He left it on the desk. If this stayed with you, subscribe if you're new, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me, what did someone do for you quietly, once, that changed everything? I read everyone. See you in the next story.